This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Living Economics is brought to you by Respectonomics, by Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am your voice of Respectonomics. Living Economics is designed to bring the reality of our economic conditions into a frontal, transparent perspective. We're going to be talking today, and it sounds almost poetic, we're going to be talking about the locust of inflation and the famine of affordability. Now, the locust has a habit of descending on crops and eating every single part of the crop. So there's no yield, it's done. And then we experience from that one of famine. And here we have this example of a locust of inflation that eats everything and resulting in this famine of affordability. I want to be clear about one thing, and that is when we read economic and financial reports, we're often treated to many statistical pieces of evidence, which I'm not doubting their integrity or their conveyance. What I want to point out to us all is what in fact is better described as a feeling. There was a High Court judge once, a Supreme Court judge, who was talking about obscenity. He said he couldn't define it, but he could always recognize it. And I think we're in that same kind of boat today. We recognize inflation, we recognize the lack of affordability, and the statistics don't really bear us out. Let's talk about some realities. That the inflationary numbers that we see in the press, they have these remarkable long decimal points to them, 2.1563%. And yet the price of gas is up by 45%. Or you think of food prices, where some people have told me that their bill from a year ago is up by 20%. Now, I want to make one point here as well. When we do these podcasts, these reports, we try to make them generic, in other words, outside of the actual timing. But timing is very important now. So we've got oil prices rising, we've got metal prices rising, we've got wages rising. So when we get all these things added together, the timeliness of what we're talking about is important. It is March 2026. We're going to start talking about, though, how does this inflation come into being? What is its root cause? And the first thing we need to look at is government deficits. Deficits worldwide have been growing almost without limitation. So whether you look at the United States, whether you look at Canada, whether you look at Britain, whether you look at Germany, which was always reluctant to run any kind of deficit financing, it has become the mot du jour. It's okay to run a deficit. So we have these deficits that are running almost out of control. And here's an interesting point about a government deficit. A government deficit can only happen when the government issues a bond. In the case of the Canadian government says we're going to run a deficit, we're going to issue bonds to be the IOUs that pay for this imbalance at the moment. And here's the key. Who's buying these bonds? Because my experience is fewer and fewer people are buying bonds. It used to be the sort of the meal of the day. But people are not buying bonds today, because if you say I'm going to pay you 5% for 30 years or 20 years or 10 years even, there's a sense that that is a huge risk, because we do not know how the prices will perform. In other words, the rate of interest really doesn't particularly dovetail with either the current rate of inflation, the forecast rate of inflation, or in fact with the risks associated with any kind of economic outlook. I mean, it's wonderful, isn't it, how governments will tell us that they know the deficits or the surplus is going to be A, B, and C in 3 years' time. Well, given the fact that most of us can't even say whether it's going to rain or snow tomorrow, well, we might know the snow part, but we have an appalling record of forecasting weather. So it begs the question, where do these forecasts come from? So we've got the government deficits. The government deficits are an organ of money supply by definition. If you run a deficit and you are therefore borrowing money, the borrowed money comes back into the government's till, it comes into circulation, and it's called money supply. So what we've got is a rising money supply directly attributable to government deficits, and also that money supply, as it results in more money in circulation, it's almost a question of definition that it raises the prices of things. If you have more money in circulation and the money is greater than, or the increase in the money supply is greater than the natural growth or the output of the economy, it's a sort of QED, quadrate eret demonstrandum. It has been proven that more money in circulation will result in this inflationary bias. Then we get into this whole issue of interest rates, because conventional economics says raise interest rates to slow down the demand for credit. Well, in the last 10 years, what you actually saw was the complete opposite of that. You saw interest rates very low, allowing money to be plentifully supplied into the system. So the whole interest rate paradigm was really thrown to the wolves. And now we have another problem. We have a situation where inflation is upon us because of the supply constraints, because of the oil prices, because of the imbalances that are occurring elsewhere in the world. And when you have that, you then get this extraordinary sense that, oh, well, we will raise interest rates to compensate for these higher prices. Well, actually, two things. One is raising an interest rate at a time when people are struggling with their own debts and mortgages and so on is counterproductive. It's almost, I would believe, socially damaging. And then at the same time, if you're raising the price of money, it is by definition raising overall prices. So in actual fact, it contributes to the inflation. We all know that when credit is out of control and people are borrowing too much money or corporations are borrowing too much money, yes, of course, there's a case then to raise the price. But it doesn't make sense to be raising the price of money in today's world. Then we have the issues of where is this money all going to? And here we've got two problems that we need to address. One is that we have somehow created this atmosphere of wealth. We talk about wealth, we talk about increasing wealth. And I think we should, in the horse world, draw on the reins, pull it back, and take a look at what we really want, which is value. Value and wealth are in fact sisters, but you can't have wealth without value. In other words, we need to have more value. And one of the questions that we can ask of governments and of ourselves and of corporations, of our families, is a question of what value we are contributing. If we are contributing value, that is axiomatically a case for saying, yes, you can now have more wealth. But having wealth without that increased value is a direct contribution to inflation. We also have, when we talk about this wealth and value and the discord between the two, or the disconnection, we see another disconnection, socially and morally, a very frightening one, but at the same time economically very dangerous as well. And that is the divergence of the proverbial frontline worker and the senior executives. It used to be that the front line was paid $10,000 a year. The senior management would earn $170,000 a year. There was a multiplication of 17 times. Take it or leave it, whether that was right or wrong. But today's world, we see figures like 400 times, 600 times, 1,000 times. We see incredible payouts to executives, to senior management, to directors, and so on. And the question is that a reflection of increased wealth, or is it a reflection of increased value? And I suspect that just like the High Court judge who said, I'm not sure if I can define it, I think we can define that these payouts are not contiguous. They are inconsistent with the creation of value. So we've got this business of the front line and the leadership. Let's put those in two big brackets and say one is getting very well paid and one is not. We see the boards of directors today. Boards of directors have, in many cases, have become captive to the company itself. In other words, they've lost their impartiality. They've lost that sense of being disinterested. That's not the same as being uninterested. Disinterested means being impartial and being able to reflect on the activities of the corporation, setting policies that are beneficial to the shareholders and, of course, ultimately to society. But what we've got in boards today is not only this captive sense of being captive to the CEO or to the management of the corporation. I'll give you one example. There's a bank that has actually got its CEO on the board. And it's true that the CEO doesn't have the vote, but my goodness, what a place of influence, what a place of being able to say, actually, let's do it my way. Reminds you of the song, doesn't it? Going my way. Then you've got the boards looking after the regulatory aspects. Governments today have an enormous sphere of regulatory oversight. And in many cases, boards, they will look at documents 2, 3, 4 inches, I suppose it's centimeters, 8 centimeters thick. But the point of the matter is the boards are accommodating a lot of the regulatory work rather than emphasizing their responsibilities to the shareholders and to the future policies or the existing policies of the corporation. We've got this, therefore, these divergent patterns. One of the most difficult things with inflation specifically is that in some sectors, it is, well, most sectors, inflation is literally a locust. It eats away at one's wealth, one's sense of well-being, one's sense of hope, one's sense of prosperity. A locust takes everything. Inflation does the same thing. Let's not kid ourselves. Inflation, we may say, well, the value of my house went up by, 200%. But in fact, that is in a way, is a fake because the value has gone up by 200%, but so has everything else in one degree or another. And even if you wanted to replace the house, you're going to pay 200% more for the other house. So in other words, it's somewhat circular. The issue of affordability is crucial. People are finding life more and more difficult to afford. They're having to think about things like whether they can afford a trip or whether they can afford a night out. And the problem with affordability is that it's a very pressing, it's very incestuous almost, it's invisible. It gets at you and you're not even sure that it's actually happening. But it can bring about a lack of sense of reality to oneself, in one's spending, one's saving, one's investing, and so on. It's a nasty, nasty problem, affordability. And as anybody in poverty groups will tell us, the affordability factor becomes overwhelming. The issue here is that we keep coming back to the inflation that's taking place, the attack that's taking place on our sense of wealth and our sense of hope. And they all combine together. And one of the things that's very dangerous in this business of inflation is we've just said that the person who's experiencing difficulties with inflation and affordability may be a total counterpoint to the one at the top of the food chain who has significant assets. Because if you have significant assets and it's a period of inflation and a period of rising interest rates, one could, in the vernacular, say, wow, what a bonanza, because the value of the assets will be rising and the value of income derived from those assets will be rising because of the higher interest rates. Therefore, you get a very imperfect view of this inflationary and affordability issue when, in fact, the powers that be, the levers, are in control of the people who actually benefit from these issues, these trends of higher prices. Therefore, we now come to what's called the fix. One of the members of our team, David, has repeatedly said, by all means, identify the problems, by all means, have a meeting, by all means, discuss these things, put them out in the open. But we need to say, what is the next step? We cannot just leave this in a vacuum and say, well, there it is. That's not a good enough answer. If you look across Facebook, you'll notice something very interesting. Every day, practically, there's a story about somebody who did something remarkable. It might have been in the first century, it might be in the 1800s, it might be more current. But you hear about some remarkable innovation by an individual, and often from a very, very unlikely background. I'm going to contest that we are all from unlikely backgrounds, and that each of one of us can be this acorn that turns into an oak tree of solutions. That is a motivational comment. It doesn't have substance to it empirically, but it is one to recognize that the small beginnings become great results. The fix, then, we've got four fixes that we would like to put on the table. And the first one is, and I'm going to quote you here from Ronald Reagan, the late President of the United States, who wrote, or said rather, he said, the greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one who gets the people to do the greatest things. So we want a leadership that will abrogate itself from its own sense of opulence and success and so on, and provide the opportunity and the encouragement for people to be reaching their potential. That is, in fact, the cornerstone to respectonomics. It's called dignifying another human being. If we dignify another human being, we develop the sense of worth, and the sense of worth is a direct corollary to the sense of value. Therefore, the first thing that leadership needs to do is to look at what is it doing in order to build up the strengths, the character, the potential of the individual. Then we have to have an underlying social conscience where we basically say we demand value over wealth. We know that many people are paid. It doesn't matter whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, the community, wherever you might be in your own family. But we have a right, in fact, we have a duty to ask this one question: what value are you giving over the wealth? In other words, we want to, you, me, and you can ask me the same question. Jeremy at respectonomics.com. Ask me, put me in front of the troops. Give us the opportunity to talk about what values are we providing as distinct from just wealth. Then we need to talk about compensation. Compensation is one where we can ask the same question. You've become paid a certain amount of money. It is perfectly reasonable to ask one question to that, whether it's $10,000, $100,000, or $10 million. The question we have a right to ask is, how did you create value? We keep coming back to this concept of the value, the sense of dignity, the sense of that intrinsic worth of the individual. And if the wealth is greater than the value, we have a problem. It's called inflation. So what we need to do is to ask people when they're having in their compensation. Boards of directors need to ask, how did you create value? We need to see this at annual meetings. How did you create value? We need to see it in associations and groups where they come together and talk about some wonderful possibilities and ways of gathering people together. Why don't we still ask that question? How did you create value? And the last one is this. This is very specific because so far, a lot of what we've talked about is that underbelly of where one knows one's feelings, but somehow it isn't actually being expressed in reality. But you know it, you know it, you know it. What I want to talk about now we want to talk about is what tax incentives can be introduced to confront the significant employee payouts. Everybody knows that the income tax rules say that if you earn more money, you pay more tax. That in and of itself is straightforward, and it is fairly clear to all of us that as we run up the scale of salaries and compensation, so also should the taxes that we pay. That's a reasonable connection. However, if there's a payout that is made to, let's say, leadership, that is in fact more of a question of wealth than value, then there needs to be a tax policy that says, yes, the individual has received this compensation of $10 million, dollars, but because that amount of money is so far away from what the front line is working. In other words, when we see the demarcation between the front line and the senior management, whatever that number is, let's call it 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, we can all come up with a figure we think is reasonable. Let's say it's 50 times. Then what you do is you would say anything beyond that 50 times factor needs to be approved literally and specifically by the shareholders. And on top of that, that amount of money that is paid out is then subject to an additional corporate tax. So the tax that's applicable to the corporation will be on that amount of money that's being paid out. That means that the employees, the consumers, the shareholders, all of the constituent parts can see whether, in fact, that's a useful value, not only in terms of the individual being compensated, but also the physical cost to the corporation. It's an area we need to work on. This is the conclusion of the living economics. This is the second one. We're dealing here with inflation. We're dealing with the issues of affordability. We welcome your comments. We welcome the opportunity to make this presentation or presentations related to this to your groups, to your organizations, and so on. We can be contacted at jeremy@respectonomics.com. Jeremy@respectonomics.com. And we look forward to your feedback. We look forward to hearing your opinions and your ideas. And we believe that we need to be one and all driven to bringing the rate of inflation down and to increase affordability so that people can look at prosperity as something that's within their realm of opportunity and, in fact, within the realm of hope. I rest my case.